Hello, welcome back. So this video is on a topic that I think is a little bit, dreadful is probably too strong of a word, but let's just say not exciting. It's an important topic though, and it's one that's going to come up a lot more when we talk about object-oriented programming and defining our own classes. But it's a topic called scope, and it basically refers to the fact that variables and properties in Python are not always available in every single part of an application or in every single part of our code. There are rules governing where our variables can be accessed. And so far, we haven't encountered any problems because we haven't been working with multiple functions or nested functions or basically anything that would cause scope issues. So what I want to do in this video is just introduce the idea of scope, show you a couple of problems that arise with functions and solutions to get around them. So the first thing to know is that in any function, whenever we define a variable inside that function, it is scoped to that function, meaning it's only available inside that function. So here's an example, in this case, where this variable instructor is not defined inside of the function. It's defined up top, outside, and that's called in the global scope, which we'll come back to. And inside of say hello, I am just returning that value, which should be colt, and when we run say hello, we get hello colt. So this should not be new. But this example, we have say hello, where we're defining instructor inside of say hello. So it is scoped right here, and instructor is only available inside the bounds of this function. So up to here. And afterwards, so we can run say hello and it works. It's going to print or return hello instructor. But if I try and then print instructor directly, I can't access the variable instructor outside of this function. So let me show you proof of that. I have the same code here. I have instructor defined inside of say hello. And if I try and run this, I get name instructor is not defined, as you can see here. And let me actually change this. I'll do instructor 2 and instructor 1. And I'll have this equal to how about Mary? And instructor 2 is colt. So I can print instructor 1, but if I try printing instructor 2 and I change this to be instructor 2, I should be able to print instructor 1 afterwards, but not instructor 2. And you can see I get Mary, but then Python freaks out with instructor 2 because it only exists inside of this function. So this is a really important concept. When you define a function and you have variables in there, whether it's instructor or a list or 20 other variables, they are scoped to that function. They're not available outside of it. There are ways of having access to them outside of that exact function. For example, you can return them. So here we're returning, well, it's a string, hello instructor, but we could also just return instructor. And we would have access to it anytime we called say hello, we could save it to a variable. But as far as talking about these strategies and structuring our programs, I'm going to wait to handle scope in that context until we talk about object-oriented programming and classes. So for now, just know functions have their own scope, and we can't access variables outside of those functions that are defined inside of a function. Now, next up is this thing called global. I talked about how there is a global scope. So for example, this variable right here is called total. It's not defined inside of a function. This is every variable we've defined, well, pretty much every variable so far that's not in a function. It is considered a global variable. And there's a problem. If I try and actually manipulate a global variable inside of a function, like I tried right here, where I have a function increment, and it just says, okay, take this variable total and add 1 to it, and then return total. Seems like that should work, but it actually doesn't. Here's proof for you. It's the exact same code. Let's try running it. I get this error, local variable total referenced before assignment. And this actually tells us a lot. It not only says that it can't find the variable total, but it says that it's looking for a local variable. So because we're inside of a function, when we reference total, it assumes that there is a local variable scoped to this function called total. And the reason for this is that it's actually not really a good idea to use global variables. Sometimes you need to, but you want to minimize the number of them. But that is for another conversation when we talk about object-oriented programming. So for now, we do have global variables, and if we need to have one, if we needed something, this is a silly example because we don't have to have a global total. We could move this inside. But for now, just to explain how all of this works, there is a way to tell Python, don't look for a local variable inside this function called total, look for a global variable called total. And that looks like this, the global keyword. So what this line says right here inside of the increment function, it's basically saying whenever I use the total variable name, I'm actually referring to the global variable total. So this one up here. And we have to do this first before we can actually manipulate total. So if we go back to our first little bit of code over here, and I just add in global total, I'm saying, hey guys, inside this function, total refers to this total, the global one. And now if I try executing it, well, we don't get an error. Let's actually print out the results. So print, there we go. And we now get the correct total, which is 1. And every time I run this, and it's a stupid little function, but I should increment total by 1. And then if we print it out, we should see 2 and 3 and so on next time. So the key thing to take away here, if I want to manipulate a variable that is not defined inside of this function, it's in the global scope, I need to first tell Python what I'm referring to when I say total, because by default, it's looking inside of this function exclusively to find something called total. The other thing I should mention, if we're only doing this, let me comment all this out. If I'm only trying to access a value, I'm not trying to change it. So for example, I have name set to Rusty. And if I have a function that just says def greet, and all that it does is print name, very silly. But if I call greet, just like this, it's going to work just fine. We're able to access the value. I can say, what is the value of the name variable? And that works. You can see we get Rusty. But as soon as I try and do something like name plus equals Steele, I want to add his last name to Rusty, and I run it now, we get the same problem. Name is not defined in the local scope. Now if I did name equals Rusty Steele, if we take a look now, that should work just fine because I am defining a name variable in the local scope. So if I don't care what was in name before, I could just override it. But if I'm trying to manipulate the existing value, I need to first say global name like we did up here. Okay, so that's that for global. I know it's kind of weird, heady stuff. It's maybe not the most intuitive thing ever. One last thing to talk about with scope, and then we can take a breather. There's another keyword called non-local. Non-local lets us modify a parent's variables in a nested function. So for example here, I have a function called outer with a variable set to count. And then in inner, I'm able to access this count variable, manipulate it, because I've declared it as non-local. So it's very similar to global, except count right here is not a global variable. It's not defined in a global scope. It's defined in the outer function's own scope. So this keyword non-local basically says this variable count that I'm referring to from here on out is not defined in inner, and it's not defined in the global scope, but it's defined in a parent or some other function that I'm nested inside of. So we can take a deep breath because as this note indicates, you will not find yourself using global or non-local all that often, but they help illustrate how scope works. And it's really important to understand just the concept of scope, that not every bit of data is available everywhere in a Python application or program. It really depends on how it's broken up into functions and then really into classes and objects, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about scope then. So my advice to you is to not get too hung up on any of the stuff in this video. I just wanted to kind of put it out there, lay it on the table, say, hey, there's this thing called scope. Don't freak out though, because we will spend a lot of time with it. What's most important at this point is getting comfortable with functions, writing functions with parameters and default parameters and return values and all of that. Okay,